You have a book you love. Not a book you feel you are should read. An actual favorite. Something that has brought you genuine pleasure before. It's sitting right there, and you haven't touched it in 4 months. You have a guitar you saved up for. A recipe you bookmarked because it genuinely excited you. A friend you adore who you keep meaning to call. And somehow, week after week, none of it happens. Not because life is too full. You have time. Not because you forgot. You know exactly where all of it is. And the knowledge sits there like a splinter. Low and persistent. Mildly irritating. This is not the procrastination people usually talk about. That version? The tax return. The difficult email. The dentist appointment. Has a certain logic to it. Those things carry threat. They carry consequence. The avoidance makes a grim kind of sense. But avoiding something you love? That is a different animal entirely. Quieter. More confusing. And in some ways, significantly more revealing. The term procrastination comes from the Latin, e procrastinare, to put forward until tomorrow. But the psychological literature has spent decades arguing about what is actually happening underneath the delay. The dominant model for most of the 20th century treated procrastination as a time management problem. You were bad at planning. You underestimated how long things take. You needed a better calendar system. This framework was not only wrong, it was precisely the kind of wrong that makes things worse, because it produces guilt without insight. In 2007, a meta-analysis led by Piers Steele at the University of Calgary examined over 800 studies on procrastination and arrived at a conclusion that reframed the entire field. Procrastination is not about time. It is about emotion regulation. Specifically, it is about avoiding a negative emotional state that is anticipated, not necessarily real, not necessarily rational, but anticipated. The task itself matters far less than the feelings the task is expected to generate. This sounds counterintuitive when applied to something enjoyable. If you are not expecting a negative emotion, if I know the guitar feels good, the book is absorbing, the conversation with your friend is nourishing, then what are you regulating? What is a threat? The answer requires moving closer to the actual moment of avoidance, to the split second before you decide not to begin. Something happens there. Something small and quiet and almost invisible that determines the entire outcome. This is where it gets strange, and where the answer requires looking not at the moment of avoidance, but at the moment just before it. Researchers studying approach avoidance conflict, a concept developed by Kurt Lewin in the 1930s and later extended by Neil Miller, found that the closer you get to something meaningful, the more intensely you feel both the pull toward it and the urge to withdraw. Not either or. Both, simultaneously, scaling in intensity as the goal approaches. Miller's gradient theory established that the avoidance gradient rises more steeply than the approach gradient as you near a goal. In practical terms, the more real something becomes, the more clearly you can see what it costs. A vague idea of playing guitar carries no weight. Actually, picking it up forces a reckoning with how long since you last played, with how much you have lost, with whether you are still who you thought you were. This is the first layer. Enjoyed activities are not neutral. They carry identity weight. They make claims about who you are. Reading that novel positions you as someone who reads novels, who has that relationship with literature, who values that kind of time. Playing guitar positions you as someone who plays guitar. The longer the gap, the more uncertain that identity becomes. And the more the activity starts to feel like a test you might fail. Not a test of skill, a test of self-denial. And that is a significantly harder thing to risk. Psychologist Roy Baumeister described a concept he called ego depletion. The idea that self-regulatory resources are finite, and that making decisions, resisting temptation, and managing emotions across the day gradually exhausts them. Later research has complicated the picture considerably, but the underlying insight persists. When you are already managing a demanding internal landscape, the cost of engaging with something emotionally significant rises sharply. It is not laziness. It is a kind of resource rationing that happens almost entirely below conscious awareness. There is a related mechanism called hedonic forecasting error, first documented clearly by Daniel Kahneman and colleagues in the 1990s under the broader framework of effective forecasting. We are chronically inaccurate at predicting how experiences will feel. We know this abstractly. But there is a specific asymmetry in the errors. We tend to overestimate the emotional cost of entry, the first few minutes of an activity, while significantly underestimating the absorbed pleasure of being fully inside it. In other words, the anticipation of sitting down to read feels harder than reading actually is. The gap is not rational. It is structural, baked into how the brain prices future experience against present resistance. This forecasting failure compounds with another well-documented phenomenon, loss aversion. Kahneman and Tversky established in the 1970s that losses loom approximately twice as large as equivalent gains in human decision-making. When an enjoyed activity is proximate, when it is a real option sitting in front of you, you are not just weighing the pleasure, you are weighing the potential disappointment. What if the book does not hit the same way? What if the guitar sounds worse than you remembered? What if the call with your friend is somehow flat? The possibility of losing the ideal version of the thing, the version preserved in memory, can outweigh the probability of genuine enjoyment. There is also a temporal dimension that most analyses miss. Shai Davidai and Thomas Gilovich at Cornell have studied what they call the ideal self and its relationship to regret. Their research suggests that people regret inactions, things they never did, far more profoundly than actions, particularly over long time horizons. But this does not help in the moment of decision. In the moment, the inaction feels safe. The thing you have not done yet can still be everything you hope it will be. The thing you do exists now in reality, subject to all the ordinary failures of reality. There is a particular cruelty in this when applied to creative work or creative hobbies. The philosopher Kiran Setia writes about what he calls atelic activities, activities whose value lies entirely in the doing, with no completion point, no external product to measure. Reading for pleasure, conversation, music, as an amateur. These are activities that cannot be achieved. They can only be inhabiting. And inhabiting something is psychologically very different from completing it. It offers no external validation, no finish line, no evidence that the time was well spent. In a culture that constantly asks, "What did you accomplish today?" inhabiting something feels almost irresponsible. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa has written extensively about what he calls social acceleration. The experience of time speeding up not physically but subjectively, driven by the increasing velocity of social expectations, technological change, and economic competition. His argument is that acceleration produces a specific psychological condition, the sense that there is never enough time, that everything has a cost, that rest is always provisional. Under these conditions, leisure activities stop feeling like leisure. They become one more item on the list. And once something is on the list, it can be procrastinated. This is how hobbies die quietly, not through dramatic loss of interest, not through any single decision to stop, but through a slow accretion of small delays until the activity exists mainly as an intention, as a category of self that has not been updated in months or years. The gap becomes the thing. The relationship between you and the activity calcifies around avoidance, and eventually the avoidance is all that is left. And this is where it connects back to the research on emotional anticipation. Once the gap is long enough, returning carries genuine risk. You are not just picking up a guitar, you are confronting what the gap means. You are looking directly at the time you have spent not doing this thing you love. That confrontation produces a specific flavor of anxiety that Timothy Pychyl, one of the leading procrastination researchers at Carleton University, identifies as task aversion rooted in self-criticism rather than the task itself. The task is fine. It is the meaning the task has accrued that becomes intolerable. In relationships, this pattern takes a particular and sometimes painful form. A friendship that matters, not a routine one, but one that genuinely nourishes you, can develop the same structure. You want a call. You know the call will be good, and yet the wanting itself generates hesitation, because a call that matters is a call you might get wrong. It requires you to show up fully. It requires something from you beyond pleasantries. And so you wait for a better moment, a moment when you feel more like yourself, and the better moment slides perpetually forward, while the friendship quietly suffers from the very care you have for it. Romantic relationships show this pattern in its most acute form. Research by Arthur Aaron on self-expansion theory. The idea that close relationships grow through novel, shared experience suggests that the activities we do with partners that we genuinely enjoy are among the most powerful relational investments available. And yet couples often procrastinate exactly these activities. The holiday, the night out, the shared project. Not because they do not want them, because wanting them means they And mattering introduces the possibility of disappointment that feels too large to risk on an idle Tuesday. So what does this mean for you specifically? If you recognize this, the book, the guitar, the friend, the project that lives permanently in the near future, it is worth sitting with what you are actually protecting, because there is something being protected. The avoidance is not random. It is serving a function, even if that function has long since stopped making sense. The research suggests a few things that are structurally true about this kind of avoidance. First, the gap between intention and action almost always closes faster in reality than in anticipation. The dread of beginning dissolves within minutes of beginning. This has been documented across dozens of laboratory conditions and ecological momentary studies. Second, the identity anxiety. The worry that you are no longer the person this activity requires you to be typically resolves on contact. You are still the person who reads, who plays, who connects. You just needed to remember it by doing. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the way you relate to an activity that matters to you is probably the way you relate to yourself. The distancing, the delay, the preservation of the ideal rather than the risking of the real. These are not quirks of leisure. They are patterns of self-relation that tend to play out across every domain that carries genuine meaning for you. The guitar and the book and the friend are not separate problems. They are the same structure in different clothes. There is a philosophical observation worth ending on. That is not a solution and not advice. Blaise Pascal wrote, in the 17th century, that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. The line is usually quoted as commentary on distraction. But read in the context of this particular psychology, it suggests something different. That the activities closest to stillness, reading alone, playing music alone, the quiet nourishment of a good conversation, are exactly the activities that require us to be most fully present to ourselves. And full presence is uncomfortable, not because the activity is hard, because we are not always easy to be with. The avoidance of enjoyment is, in this reading, a kind of flight from the self. Not dramatic, nothing so literary as that. Just the ordinary friction of being a person who prefers the version of themselves in potential, always about to begin, never subject to the small indignities of actually being in the room. The ideal reader, the ideal musician, the ideal friend. These versions of you require no performance. They exist in perfect suspension, protected by delay. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that the thing matters. The things that do not matter are easy to approach. You do not procrastinate on things you are indifferent to. The delay is almost always proportional to the significance, which means that behind every long-avoided pleasure, there's something genuine and intact and still waiting. Not patiently, exactly, but waiting. The guitar does not hold a grudge. The book does not know how long it has been. The friend, probably, misses you too.